dosing for protein. It's something that I have never heard my diabetes consultant mention, or the diabetes nurse, and I don't think they understand it. They don't mention it because they don't understand. They don't know how much insulin one might need, and of course we're all different, for protein, to cover the protein in their diet. Now my meals are usually protein based, and I have to figure out, I'm still learning, I'm still experimenting, and different proteins seem to have different effects on my blood sugar. So I'm learning that whole concept all by myself through experimentation. And most of the time, the insulin I take is actually insulin to cover the protein rather than the carbohydrates, because the carbohydrates will be so low, that like about 5 grams or something, so that they won't make that much difference on my blood sugars, but the protein itself will make a difference. So I'm still learning. It's something new to me, learning how much insulin to take to cover the protein.
So before you ask me another question, I'd like to ask you, how then do you work out how much to give for your protein?
I'm eyeballing it now. I don't calculate, because I think it's just too restricting to calculate and look at how many grams of protein you're having, because once you start doing all the maths, you might be disappointed that, what works one day doesn't necessarily work the next day. So I eyeball it, and I'm learning to do a good job with it. So I've discovered, for example, that red meat like steak has a bigger impact on my blood sugars than fish. And the protein that has the least impact is eggs. And that might just be me, and I haven't been able to find out why that might be, but I'm learning. I'm just experimenting. I've been a vegetarian for 30 years. So only last year, in fact, 11 months ago, I started introducing meat into my diet. So this is very new to me. So my HbA1c in fact went up from 5.7% to 6.1%, and I was hugely disappointed. My diabetes consultant was not disappointed, and he said, for a type 1, it's still 6.1, but I want to go back to 5.7 and keep eating meat because it's making me a healthier person. I also exercise, I do weightlifting, so I am benefiting from the larger sort of protein portions. But I need to cover it with insulin. It's something I had to learn completely on my own. So,
well, the reason I asked you was to stop you asking me how people should calculate how much to give for protein, because I don't have an answer. So one of my books is to support people with type 1 diabetes, and for that I looked into all the different techniques that people are advised to calculate insulin dosing for protein, and there are lots of different ones. Some are based on calories, some are based on grams of protein, and different amounts. So I like to keep things really simple, and if someone's starting out with this, what I would generally suggest is as you explain, if you're having, say, a big portion of red meat that you know is going to have an effect, don't inject anything beforehand, but at your next meal, or if it's an evening when you go to bed, monitor your glucose level and give yourself a correction dose, as most people with type 1 will be familiar with, and see if that will work. And so that would be step 1. That would then give you an idea as to how much insulin you need to cover that type and that amount of protein. And some people are very happy to do that. If their HbA1c is staying stable and they're getting spikes, but they can correct it, they're happy to do it retrospectively. Others who don't want to see that spike happening at all, we want to know, well, okay, but I want to give that protein, I want to give that insulin to avoid that. When should I give it? And my answer is, well, I don't know. That's for you to find out. which is really what you're saying. So my first suggestion might be, well, let's say that you have a steak and you find you need to give yourself 3 units as a correction dose. So in theory, then you need 3 units to cover it, but it's going to be over a prolonged period of time. It's going to be delayed. So I'd probably say, well, don't give the 3 units before you eat. Maybe give yourself 1 unit after you've eaten, when you've finished the meal, and give yourself 1 unit. Then check a couple of hours later and maybe give yourself another unit. But doing it in a stepwise fashion, so that you can learn what your body requires. But then it's going to be different. If you're eating a big steak because you've spent the day cycling 100 kilometers, you're not going to need that insulin. So it is also individual. So I can't give a more concrete answer than that, but to people to do it in a stepwise way and to use their common sense and give very small amounts.
May I mention what I do, just something that might be important to the topic here. Usually after a meat-based meal, I see the protein spiking my blood sugars about 4 hours after I've eaten. Generally, roughly, it could be 3 hours, it could be 5 or even 6.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but the interesting thing is, so that's why I've now shifted my evening meal, or I only have 2 meals a day, but the second meal to 4 p.m. because then when protein starts spiking my blood sugars, then I can address it before I go to sleep. I do wear the CGM, the Libre 2. Unfortunately, it doesn't always alarm and wake me up through the night. So I don't want the blood sugar rises at night. So I'd rather address it while I'm still awake. So I have my last meal of the day about 4, latest 5 p.m. So I'm still awake while protein is having an impact on my blood sugars. The other interesting thing is, if I combine steak to cheese to cheese, so steak and cheese together could cause a rise in my blood sugars even 8 to 12 hours later. So these are interesting things you can only find out by experimenting and trying and see what works for you.
And that illustrates the fact that fat slows down the absorption of food from the guts. So adding the cheese hugely increases the fat content of the meal, which slows it right down.